Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we delve once more into the overlooked corners of history, seeking those subtle moments that influence the world in understated ways. Whether you're settled comfortably in bed or relaxing with your eyes shut, I'm pleased you're joining me for this serene journey. I'd be curious to hear where you're listening from and what time it is there in your corner of the globe. Are you starting your day or preparing to fall asleep with echoes of the past in your mind? If these tranquil explorations through time are appealing to you, please consider subscribing. Many more such evenings await us. What I'm about to share will upend all your assumptions about Victorian propriety. Beneath the polished facade of refined ladies overseeing their homes and hosting tea gatherings, a silent epidemic was stealthily taking lives in parlors across England and America. These women weren't lawbreakers or social rejects. They were mothers, spouses, daughters, and cornerstones of their communities who fell prey unwittingly to the most hazardous wonder remedy of their time. In this series, I'll guide you into the concealed realm of Victorian opium addiction, where the boundary between remedy and toxin faded entirely. We'll explore the poignant tales of actual women whose names were mentioned only in whispers, whose enigmatic passings were dismissed as anxious disorders or fragile health. But first, allow me to illustrate the true extent of this quiet catastrophe. Consider Charlotte Winslow, whose experience grew sadly typical in the Victorian period. In 1853, Charlotte embodied all that society demanded of a genteel woman. She ran her husband's Boston home with exacting order, nurtured 3 children with steadfast commitment, and always attended every philanthropic event. Yet behind those closed doors, Charlotte waged a struggle that would eventually end her life. It began quite harmlessly. Following the challenging delivery of her youngest daughter, Charlotte's doctor recommended laudanum for what he termed her nervous fatigue. Just a couple of drops in water, taken in the morning and evening, to soothe her nerves and rebuild her vitality. The amber fluid had a sharp taste, but soon after ingesting it, Charlotte sensed a gentle warmth flowing through her body, easing not only her bodily discomfort but also every concern troubling her thoughts. Unbeknownst to Charlotte, she had just ingested her initial portion of liquid opium, a material so intensely habit-forming that it would shortly dominate her whole life. In a matter of weeks, the assigned amounts failed to deliver the prior comfort. Charlotte started using the remedy 3 times daily, then 4, and eventually whenever the known twinge of withdrawal started seeping into her frame. The most cunning element of this sorrow was how utterly accepted laudanum had become in Victorian culture. Step into any pharmacy in London or New York, and you'd see numerous proprietary remedies laced with opium. Godfrey's cordial for infants cutting teeth, Dover's powder for migraines, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for issues ranging from menstrual pains to sadness. These weren't stashed away in dim corners or peddled by dubious vendors. They sat prominently on store shelves, promoted in reputable publications, and endorsed by trusted doctors. For Victorian women, laudanum wasn't merely a treatment, it was deliverance. During a time when women possessed almost no authority over their own bodies or existences, when they were required to bear childbirth silently, handle homes unaided, and stifle all feelings except mild satisfaction, laudanum granted something invaluable: respite. A mere few drops could turn a day filled with unending home tasks into one that felt manageable. It could hush the cries of colicky infants, alleviate the agony of yet another tough pregnancy, and offer a short reprieve from the overwhelming burden of cultural demands. However, this refuge carried a cost that most women only uncovered when it was much too late. The very traits that rendered laudanum so enticing also rendered it profoundly addictive. The opium didn't simply dull pain. It altered the brain's chemical balance, forging a bodily reliance that intensified with each intake. Women who had begun laudanum for valid health reasons soon discovered they couldn't operate without it. Think about Margaret Thornfield, the spouse of a minister in rural Yorkshire. Margaret started laudanum after acquiring what her physician labeled neuralgia, a broad diagnosis Victorian doctors frequently applied when they couldn't pinpoint a particular illness. The remedy performed splendidly at the outset. Margaret's puzzling pains vanished, and she felt more vigorous and competent than she had in ages. She immersed herself in her responsibilities as a clergyman's wife with fresh zeal, arranging relief efforts and calling on the ill with unyielding passion. But as the months went by, Margaret observed worrisome shifts. The intervals between doses grew harder to bear. She would awaken at night soaked in perspiration, her pulse pounding with unaccountable fear. In the daytime, she caught herself fixating on the clock, tallying the hours until her next serving. When she attempted to cut back the quantity, as her inner voice sometimes urged, she was hit with manifestations so intense she believed death was near. Her limbs would tremble without restraint, her gut would churn with sickness, and surges of hopelessness would engulf her so fiercely that she scarcely left her chamber. Margaret's husband, a compassionate yet innocent man who had full faith in his wife's goodness and his doctor's insight, never imagined that his wife's remedy was gradually ruining her. Like most individuals of his day, he thought addiction was a character flaw that struck only the feeble-minded and corrupt. The notion that his devout, loyal wife could grow reliant on her prescribed remedy was utterly inconceivable. This obliviousness to the truth of laudanum addiction wasn't limited to Margaret's spouse. Victorian culture had crafted an intricate myth around opium consumption that permitted upstanding folks to uphold their denial despite mounting proof. When women started ingesting larger portions of their remedies, it was ascribed to deteriorating medical states needing more potent care. When they grew reclusive and apathetic, it was faulted on womanly fragility or anxious ailments. When they perished abruptly and inexplicably, it was labeled as cardiac arrest or cerebral inflammation. The reality was much darker. These women weren't yielding to obscure diseases. They were succumbing to opium overdoses, at times unintentionally as their resistance built and they misjudged their intake, at times purposefully as the load of their habit grew intolerable. But since laudanum fatalities frequently imitated organic causes and families were eager to safeguard their standing, the full magnitude of the outbreak stayed concealed. Victorian comprehension of addiction was rudimentary at most. Physicians knew opium could form habits, but they greatly downplayed its strength and presumed that honorable people would instinctively curb their usage via ethical self-control. They didn't grasp that physical reliance could surmount even the firmest resolve, and they lacked useful remedies for withdrawal. When sufferers reported issues after lowering their laudanum amount, doctors commonly saw this as proof they still required the remedy, unwittingly promoting ongoing use. The seclusion of Victorian women exacerbated the issue. Unlike men who might meet fellow opium users in dens or via social ties, women ingested their laudanum in the seclusion of their residences, frequently unaware they weren't isolated in their plight. They had no means to share their ordeals or find aid from others who comprehended their situation. Each woman thought her escalating reliance was a private shortcoming, a concealed disgrace that had to be masked no matter what. This disgrace was heightened by the period's strict gender norms. Victorian women were meant to be ethical sentinels, pure and disciplined figures who uplifted their households through their integrity. The concept that they might fail to govern their remedy intake clashed with all that society held about female essence. Women who acknowledged their reliance confronted an unfeasible decision: confess their issue and hazard societal ruin, or persist with laudanum and wish they could reclaim command before it was overdue. Most opted to carry on quietly, devising intricate ruses to conceal their rising intake. They would patronize several pharmacies to evade doubt, assert they were acquiring remedies for unwell kin, or dispatch staff on tasks to buy laudanum from outlets around the city. Some grew adept at blending their husband's brandy with laudanum, forming a concoction that could be drunk publicly without prompting inquiries. Others concealed containers all over their homes, guaranteeing they would never lack their remedy. The monetary expense of sustaining a laudanum routine could be ruinous. As endurance rose, women demanded bigger and more regular portions to gain the same outcome. What had commenced as a few cents worth of remedy weekly could ultimately devour a large chunk of the family finances. Women would vend jewels, pawn home goods, or devise clever methods to siphon cash from their home allotments to finance their acquisitions. Some even turned to pilfering, snatching coins from their husbands' wallets or their kids' savings jars when urgency overrode their principles. But maybe the most heartbreaking facet of the laudanum outbreak was how it stripped women of their bonds with their offspring. Mothers who had once been caring and attentive turned aloof and erratic under opium's sway. They might appear abnormally cheerful and lively right after dosing, then grumpy and distant as the influence faded. Children came to interpret these emotional patterns, nearing their mothers warily in the positive phases and steering clear during the negative ones. Some mothers, seeing the harm their habit was inflicting, made frantic efforts to cease. They would dump their laudanum in the sink during bursts of determination, only to hurry servants to the pharmacy later when withdrawal pains grew unendurable. Others sought to taper their amount slowly, noting precise measures on their vials and establishing rigid timetables for use. But without healthcare backing or knowledge of the process, these tries nearly always collapsed. The medical community's lack of knowledge about addiction care meant that women who pursued assistance often got guidance that aggravated their circumstances. Doctors might advise changing to various opium mixtures, thinking diversity would somehow lessen reliance. They ordered extra substances like alcohol or chloral hydrate to handle withdrawal signs, frequently generating fresh habits beside the initial one. Some medics suggested total seclusion, confining women in exclusive retreats where they received yet more laudanum to keep them tranquil and obedient. The anguish of these women showed in manners that would astonish today's views. Eleanor Hartwell, married to a notable London financier, started pulverizing her laudanum pills and blending them into her morning tea when fluid versions no longer quenched her urges. She would perch at her mahogany breakfast table, encircled by exquisite porcelain and fresh blooms, ingesting what equaled deadly quantities of opium while chatting about the climate with her oblivious spouse. Eleanor's change was steady but evident to those who knew what to observe. Her formerly flushed skin turned pallid and waxen. Her gaze acquired a glassy, far-off look, and her gestures grew languorous and ethereal. She would doze off amid afternoon calls, her needlework slipping from slack fingers as she sank into opium-triggered hazes. When inquired about her well-being, she would grin calmly and talk of sensing marvelously serene, as though she had uncovered some hidden key to happiness that eluded others. The staff in these opulent homes often turned into unwitting partners in their ladies' habits. Mary O'Brien, Eleanor's personal attendant, later remembered being dispatched on ever more frequent trips to various chemists across London. Mrs. Hartwell would allege she required remedies for assorted complaints, a migraine cure for the chef, digestive aids for guests, sleep potions for her fretful sibling. Mary never challenged these demands because disputing one's boss just wasn't proper. And moreover, all the remedies appeared wholly valid. What Mary didn't grasp was that she was partaking in a complex diversion meant to obscure the real scale of Eleanor's intake. At the peak of her habit, Eleanor was ingesting laudanum every 2 hours nonstop. She stashed vials in her jewelry case, behind volumes in the study, even stitched into her winter coat's hem. The woman who had once taken pride in overseeing a flawless home could no longer recall if she had directed the cook or settled the weekly accounts. The social agenda that had once shaped Eleanor's life turned into a field of possible revelation. She would accept bids to tea sessions and benefit occasions, then endure torturous hours figuring when she could dose without notice. Sometimes she would step away several times in one afternoon visit, citing ladylike unease while she withdrew to partake in laudanum in the hostess's dressing room. Other times she would show up at gatherings already deeply dosed, speaking too sluggishly and grinning too widely as her acquaintances traded concerned looks. Victorian decorum offered ideal camouflage for these actions, because refined society had evolved intricate rules for overlooking awkward realities. When Eleanor started skipping key social affairs, or arriving in clearly changed states, her companions just ceased referencing it. They would converse around her state, alluding to her fragile build, or her continuing care for anxious depletion. This pact of quiet permitted the habit to advance unhindered while upholding the pretense that all was utterly ordinary. The bodily decline of laudanum dependence followed a foreseeable course that era's physicians either missed or opted to disregard. Women would shed considerable weight as the opium curbed their hunger. But this was frequently lauded as stylish slenderness instead of seen as a marker of sickness. Their complexion would gain a sallow tint. Their dentition would start decaying from the perpetual exposure to sugary patent remedies, and their locks would turn fragile and dull. Yet these alterations were often linked to the usual impacts of maturing or the strains of home life. Perhaps most sorrowfully, the mental consequences of persistent laudanum consumption deprived these women of their intellectual sharpness precisely when they needed it to perceive their dilemma. The same substance that had first honed their attention and lifted their spirits began to muddle their discernment and hinder their recall. They would overlook dialogues they had just concluded, lose hours at a time, and render ever poorer choices regarding their remedy intake. Victoria Ashworth, a vicar's daughter from Bath, illustrated this mournful downturn. Once renowned for her keen humor and vast literary knowledge, Victoria started facing what she called mental haze after months of laudanum use. She would commence a book only to find she had perused the same section thrice without recollection. In talks, she would drop her line of thought midway through a phrase, gazing blankly at her interlocutors while straining to recall her words. Victoria's kin ascribed these shifts to the expected advancement of whatever obscure malady demanded her ongoing medication. They urged her to repose more, to spare her tender intellect from demanding texts or intricate ideas. This kindly counsel only hastened her fall as the solitude and cerebral idleness rendered her more reliant on laudanum for arousal and solace. The link between laudanum habit and Victorian wedlock customs added further strata of woe. Wives were anticipated to be upbeat, obedient, and intimately accessible to their mates, irrespective of their personal sentiments or bodily condition. Laudanum supplied a synthetic answer to this unattainable standard, enabling women to carry out their spousal roles while staying emotionally detached from the act. Some women commenced extra portions before close encounters, employing opium to desensitize themselves to undesired physical contact. This employment of laudanum as a handling tool for marital assault, though never openly admitted or debated, grew alarmingly prevalent among Victorian women. The drug let them detach from painful ordeals while preserving the veneer of dutiful obedience. Husbands frequently read their wives' drugged passivity as fulfillment, never realizing they were basically violating insensible women. The gestation ordeals of laudanum-dependent women were especially dreadful. Opium penetrates the placental wall easily, signifying that fetuses were subjected to the drug during their growth. Babies delivered to addicted mothers often endured what doctors termed anxious states or inability to flourish, not comprehending that these newborns were undergoing withdrawal from substances they had never knowingly ingested. Sarah Peyton, a trader's wife in Manchester, bore 4 children amid her years of laudanum habit. Each gestation grew successively tougher as her endurance mounted and her health worsened. Her initial offspring, conceived prior to her habit's start, was vigorous and sturdy. But her later children arrived undersized and frail, inclined to wailing spells and stomach troubles that no degree of attention appeared to mend. Sarah, eager to calm her ailing babies, would occasionally administer minuscule amounts of her own remedy, unwittingly extending the habit cycle to the subsequent generation. The trend of baby laudanum usage was so widespread that whole cohorts of Victorian youngsters were exposed to opium from birth. Proprietary remedies aimed at infants held considerable quantities of the drug, and mothers habitually dosed restless babies to keep them hushed and docile. Children who endured this early contact often acquired enduring health issues and heightened vulnerability to habit as grown-ups. As endurance thresholds climbed, some women started testing more condensed opium forms. They would buy unprocessed opium from mariners back from the East Indies, or locate Chinese migrants who could supply sturdier mixtures. These forays into opium parlors and immigrant groups marked stark breaks from Victorian decorum, but urgency had long eclipsed societal limits. The opium lairs of London's East End turned into surprising havens for elite women whose prescriptions no longer offered sufficient ease. These venues, initially catering to Chinese laborers and seafarers, started accommodating an unexpected group of elegantly attired ladies who came in veiled coaches after dusk. The owners soon mastered providing secluded chambers and unobtrusive assistance for patrons who paid top dollar for seclusion and potent drugs. Elizabeth Morrison, offspring of a distinguished judge, began patronizing such places in 1867 after her doctor declined to boost her laudanum script. Cloaked in simple attire and escorted by her most reliable servant, Elizabeth would sneak through rear doors of Limehouse opium houses, pursuing the unadulterated drug that her polished remedies could no longer deliver. She would recline on silk pillows next to Chinese workers and overseas sailors, all distinctions of rank and ethnicity vanishing in their joint chase of opium visions. These ventures grew ever riskier as Elizabeth's habit advanced. The dense opium found in the dens was vastly more powerful than anything she had known via medical paths, and her endurance estimates proved lethally wrong. On a mist-veiled night in November, Elizabeth took what she deemed her standard amount, only to fall into a coma from which she never roused. Her remains were found the following morning by her distressed servant, but the formal death cause was noted as cardiac failure to preserve her kin's honor. The concealments around laudanum fatalities evolved into an artistry among Victorian clans, frantic to defend their societal rank. Doctors were frequently complicit in these frauds, knowing that truthful death documents would wreck whole family heritages. They would inspect clearly overdosed corpses and certify demises as due to consumption, cerebral fever, or abrupt heart stoppage. Burial rites would highlight the departed's merit and devotion, omitting any reference to the laudanum vials gripped in their dead hands. The ornate burial of Elizabeth Morrison served as a model for how Victorian culture handled these sorrowful deaths. Her father, Judge Morrison, gave a touching oration about his daughter's tender build and her valiant fight against nervous depletion. The attendees, clad in their best ebony silk, nodded gravely as he recounted Elizabeth's benevolent deeds and mild disposition. None alluded to the vacant laudanum containers scattered in her sleeping quarters, or the dubious details of her passing in London's East End. This pact of hush stretched well past single families. Periodicals of the time crafted their own veiled terms for reporting laudanum deaths. They would portray women as yielding to extended maladies or anxious disorders, meticulously evading any nod to the opium that had truly slain them. Tributes extolled the deceased's forbearance in enduring agony, their loyalty to kin, and their elegant embrace of divine intent. The actual source of their torment stayed buried under strata of euphemism and cultural decorum. Dr. William Hartley, a London doctor who cared for scores of laudanum-habited women in his practice, maintained personal logs that disclosed the immense scale of the outbreak. His entries, unearthed years later, chronicled instance after instance of honorable women who had forfeited command over their remedy intake. He noted Mrs. Catherine Wells, a financier's wife, who was ingesting 40 grains of laudanum daily when she turned to him for aid. To contextualize, 2 grains was viewed as a healing dose for acute pain. Catherine was devouring 20 times the advised quantity merely to feel ordinary. Dr. Hartley's endeavors to assist these women were impeded by both medical unawareness and cultural barriers. He couldn't admit respectable ladies to hospitals beside charity patients and offenders. Yet caring for them at home meant they kept access to the very materials demolishing them. His proposed care plans read like futile exercises, stepwise cut-back timetables that sufferers couldn't adhere to, ethical sermons on resolve that overlooked addiction's bodily truth, and suggestions for journeys to far climates where patients just located fresh drug origins. The global essence of the opium commerce meant Victorian women could nourish their habits nearly anywhere in the developed world. Agnes Whitmore, evading her husband's mounting doubts about her laudanum use, joined her sister on a prolonged tour of European spas. She learned that German pharmacies vended even mightier opium mixtures than English ones, and that Swiss health resorts would furnish boundless supplies of the drug to affluent patients pursuing care for anxious states. Agnes passed 6 months shifting from spa to spa, always asserting she needed stronger remedy for her declining health. She would reach each new venue looking frail and tormented, vividly detailing symptoms any doctor would identify as needing opiate care. The European healthcare circle, even more deferential to rich English ladies than their home peers, promptly scripted whatever Agnes sought. But the incessant travel and rising drug intake started exacting a noticeable toll. Agnes's correspondence home, at first upbeat reports of picturesque peaks and healing regimens, grew ever more irregular and muddled. She would repeat the same updates several times in one missive, overlook key family occasions, and recount talks with non-existent people. Her script, once graceful and exact, turned shaky and scarcely readable. When Agnes at last returned to England, her alterations stunned even those aware of her laudanum habit. She seemed to have aged decades in her months overseas, her visage gaunt and her steps unsteady. She spoke in murmurs, as if fearful that regular speech might fracture her brittle poise. Most alarming, she appeared to dwell in a constant state of bewildered bliss, smiling calmly while addressing tragic matters and replying to unposed queries. Agnes's husband, at first thankful for her seeming tranquility after years of seeing her fretful unrest, slowly grasped that something was gravely amiss. His wife would sit for hours gazing at void, sporadically whispering to herself in tongues he didn't know. She would neglect eating for days, then abruptly devour huge meals before regurgitating all. She started donning the same garments repeatedly, apparently oblivious that they were getting dirty and creased. The staff in the Whitmore home observed their lady's downfall with rising dread. Mary, the chief housekeeper, later remembered uncovering dozens of empty laudanum vials hidden across Agnes' chamber. Some were tucked in hat cases, others slipped behind tomes or sewn into gown pockets. The sheer volume implied Agnes was ingesting quantities that would have slain a novice user. Her endurance, having attained levels defying medical grasp, was astounding. Agnes's concluding weeks mirrored a pattern sadly familiar among advanced laudanum dependents. She would have spells of relative lucidity where she acknowledged her state's gravity and vowed desperately to amend. She would discard vials of remedy down the drain, incinerate her secret caches, and pledge to her spouse that she was at last liberated from her reliance. But these lucid moments were always succeeded by overwhelming withdrawal surges that propelled her back to heavier use. She would dispatch servants on pressing quests to every pharmacy in London, claiming she needed remedy for abruptly arisen ailments. When nearby sources grew wary of her repeated buys, she started ordering laudanum via post, employing false identities and having parcels sent to various city addresses. The bodily signs of Agnes' withdrawal tries were so fierce that her husband began thinking she was truly perishing from some enigmatic illness. She would quiver uncontrollably, perspire heavily despite chill air, and endure visions that left her shrieking in fright. Her heart would pound so wildly that her beat was visible in her throat, and she would suffer from loose bowels and vomiting that left her wholly parched. These signs, which contemporary medicine identifies as typical opiate withdrawal, were viewed by Victorian doctors as proof of grave bodily disease. They would examine Agnes amid her worst times and decide she needed even mightier medications to battle whatever malady was ravaging her body. Their kindly meant cares only deepened her habit, forming a medical carousel that ensnared her in rising spirals of reliance. The mental effects of chronic laudanum use were perhaps even more shattering than the physical signs. Agnes started encountering what she termed waking visions, intricate fantasies that felt more genuine to her than real happenings. She would conduct thorough chats with her late mother, arrange gatherings for absent guests, and grow convinced that staff were pilfering from her in sleep. These illusions turned ever more suspicious and aggressive. Agnes charged her husband with attempting to toxin her, asserted her sister was scheming to seize her legacy, and became persuaded the local constabulary was surveilling her residence. She would fortify herself in her chamber for days, emerging solely to hunt for laudanum she thought others had concealed from her. The solitude enforced by these suspicious illusions hastened Agnes' downfall. Severed from human interaction by her own doubts, she dwelled in a realm inhabited wholly by drug-prompted specters. She would host lavish tea sessions with fictional attendees, holding lively dialogues with vacant seats while actual callers waited unheeded in her parlor. Her husband, observing his wife vanish into insanity, started to comprehend that her state linked to her remedy intake. But by then, Agnes's endurance was so extreme that any bid to lessen her laudanum led to signs that seemed fatal. She would crumple into spasms. Her respiration would turn shallow and erratic, and her skin would gain a bluish shade hinting at impending demise. The medical circle provided no aid for families caught in these hopeless predicaments. Doctors knew laudanum was somehow implicated in their patients' worsening, but they had no effective cures for habit and no secure ways for handling withdrawal. Their usual advice was to persist with the remedy at whatever level appeared essential to avert instant crisis, basically dooming patients to a gradual death by excess. Agnes Whitmore passed on a drizzly Tuesday dawn in October, discovered by her attendant seated calmly in her preferred armchair with an empty laudanum vial in her lap. The formal death cause was logged as cardiac failure induced by anxious depletion, a verdict that appeased the examiner and safeguarded the family's prestige. Her burial drew hundreds of grievers who lauded her mild essence and patient tolerance of pain. Unaware they were lamenting a woman who had spent her closing years gripped by ruinous habit. The consequences of these deaths often unveiled the true breadth of the laudanum outbreak in Victorian homes. When kin tidied the departed woman's belongings, they would uncover proof of intake that stunned even those who had suspected trouble. Concealed vials, covert letters with multiple pharmacies, and thorough diaries recording failed self-care attempts, sketching images of frantic women waging unwinnable fights. Rebecca Thornton, sorting her late sister's chamber, found a leather-bound journal that narrated 3 years of tried recovery from laudanum habit. The early notations were optimistic, outlining precise plans for stepwise cutback and ethical vows to surmount character flaws. But as months advanced, the notations grew ever more frantic and disjointed. The last pages held only tally lines, evidently counting daily doses, with figures climbing steadily until the script halted completely. These findings compelled families to face uneasy truths about their loved ones' final years. They realized behaviors they had linked to sickness or oddity were really habit symptoms. The enigmatic mood shifts, the repeated ailments needing isolation, the slow retreat from social pursuits, all abruptly made dreadful sense through the prism of opiate reliance. Some families elected to draw lessons from these insights, turning into champions for improved addiction awareness and cautious prescribing. But most merely demolished the proof and upheld the myth that their kin had died from natural reasons. The disgrace tied to habit was so deep that even demise couldn't vanquish it. And Victorian culture kept feigning that laudanum reliance was a scarce event afflicting only the ethically frail. The fiscal influence of the laudanum commerce forged mighty interests committed to preserving the current order. Drug firms amassed riches vending opium-laced proprietary remedies to unaware buyers, and they battled fiercely against any regulation or change tries. They financed medical periodicals, backed doctor training initiatives, and influenced officials to guarantee their lucrative goods stayed readily accessible. The promotion of these remedies grew ever more refined as rivalry heated. Firms employed chemists to craft fresh blends promising better outcomes, artists to fashion attractive wrappers, and scribes to pen ad copy that resonated with Victorian tastes. They backed endorsements from content buyers, though they meticulously shunned mentioning their goods' habit risk. Mrs. Pemberton's miracle tonic vowed to heal all from aches to heartache, while Dr. Morrison's ladies' friend specifically aimed at women enduring feminine woes. These items were sold not as narcotics but as wellness aids, vital instruments for upholding the subtle equilibrium needed for correct female operation. The ads implied that any woman not employing these concoctions was shirking her obligation to her kin and self. The endorsements in papers and journals depicted wondrous healings and renewed joy. Mrs. J.W. of Birmingham penned that Dr. Morrison's blend had rescued her union by letting her perform her wifely roles with fresh ardor. Miss S.T. of York attributed Mrs. Pemberton's tonic with banishing her gloom and restoring her trust in heavenly guidance. These artfully made approvals rendered laudanum use seem not merely tolerable but honorable. Beneath these triumph tales lay a gloomier truth of women ensnared in reliance loops they couldn't flee. The same firms that issued radiant endorsements also got frantic missives from buyers pleading for aid with issues they couldn't share with anyone. These letters, kept in company files, exposed the human toll of the laudanum trade in poignant detail. Mrs. Caroline Foster wrote to the maker of her preferred proprietary remedy, describing how she had advanced from the suggested dose twice daily to gulping whole bottles in one go. She implored for advice on lessening her intake without enduring the awful signs that came with any cutback try. Her letter closed with a request for confidentiality, as she couldn't endure the idea of her husband discovering her plight. The firm's reply, if sent, is lost to time. But the trend of these letters indicates makers knew well their goods' habit potential and chose to overlook it for sustained gains. They kept promoting laudanum blends as secure and advantageous while getting routine accounts of the ruin these items wrought in their buyers' lives. The medical field's involvement in the laudanum outbreak went beyond mere unawareness of habit. Many doctors had monetary ties to drug firms, getting payments for suggesting specific items or permitting their names in ad materials. Others held shares in medicine production companies or ran their own proprietary remedy ventures alongside. This mesh of fiscal enticements forged a setup where those who should have shielded patients from hazardous drugs instead advocated their use. Physicians would order laudanum for ailments not needing opiate care, suggest higher amounts when patients built endurance, and brush off habit worries as ethical lapses rather than health issues. Dr. Harrison Blackwell, a notable London doctor, exemplified this corruption. His private clinic served affluent women with anxious conditions, and his standard care plan involved large laudanum portions paired with prolonged rest cures. He levied huge fees for these cares while keeping financial links with 3 distinct drug firms. His patient records, found after his passing, showed he knew many clients were habituating to their remedies but persisted in scripting them. The rest cure centers that gained popularity in the Victorian age often acted as upscale habit factories, keeping rich patients drugged with huge laudanum amounts while charging kin exorbitant rates for care. These places vowed to mend anxious depletion and female hysteria via full repose and medical oversight, but they really spawned new habits, or worsened current ones. Millicent Ashford spent 8 months at the esteemed Willowbrook Sanitarium, pursuing care for what her family doctor had identified as acute neurasthenia. The center's promotional items promised groundbreaking cares based on the newest European approaches. But Millicent's ordeal mainly involved lying abed while getting regular portions of ever stronger opiate blends. The sanitarium's doctors explained that absolute repose was vital for healing from anxious conditions and that any arousal or activity would aggravate her tender state. They gave laudanum every 4 hours to ensure Millicent stayed calm and compliant, slowly upping the amounts as her body built endurance. By her departure from Willowbrook, she was ingesting more opium than upon arrival. But her kin was informed her progress was remarkable. This model of systematized habit impacted hundreds of women across England and America. Families would dispatch their daughters, wives, and mothers to costly care centers, thinking they were supplying the finest possible aid for grave health issues. Instead, they were basically paying for their dear ones to grow more profoundly habituated to perilous drugs under medical watch. The mental manipulation used by these centers was especially sly. Patients who doubted their care or voiced worries about their rising medication needs were told such concerns were signs of their root conditions. Requests to lower laudanum amounts were seen as proof of unfinished healing, warranting continued care and higher charges. Women who tried to exit these centers before their doctors judged them prepared were often declared mentally unfit and detained against their wishes. The mix of legal power, family urging, and bodily reliance on facility-supplied drugs forged a system from which flight was almost impossible. The tales of these institutional casualties stayed mostly untold because the women were either too weakened to speak for themselves or too ashamed to confess what had befallen them. Many died while still confined to these centers, their passings blamed on the advance of their original anxious conditions rather than opiate overdoses. Others returned home so harmed by their ordeals that they never again operated as autonomous persons. The laudanum epidemic's effect on Victorian childhood has been mostly ignored by scholars, but proof suggests a whole generation matured in homes where maternal drug habit was the concealed standard. Children learned to gauge their mother's tempers through the filter of dosing timetables, instinctively knowing when it was safe to seek solace and when to vanish. These youngsters crafted survival tactics that would mold their characters lifelong. They grew hyper-alert, perpetually scanning adult conduct for hints of impairment or emotional volatility. They learned self-reliance at unusually tender ages, tending their own needs when their mothers were too drugged to notice them. Most heartbreakingly, they often faulted themselves for their mother's state, believing they had somehow caused the mysterious malady requiring constant remedy. The intergenerational passage of trauma from the Laudanum epidemic would resonate through Victorian families for decades. Children raised with addicted mothers often acquired their own substance misuse issues as adults, or drew partners battling similar troubles. The normalization of drug reliance in their childhood homes made it hard for them to see habit as abnormal or hazardous. Some of these children became proponents for drug reform as grown-ups, using their painful youth experiences to push for better opiate medicine control. But many more just replicated the patterns they had absorbed at home, transmitting the legacy of habit and dysfunction to their own offspring in an unending loop of generational harm. The tragedy of laudanum habit hit its bleakest lows when examining the pharmaceutical sector's intentional aiming at pregnant women and fresh mothers. Firms like Bayer and Park Davis crafted specific ad drives that depicted opium-based remedies as essential for maternal wellness, claiming expectant mothers not using these blends were risking both themselves and their unborn. Dr. Samuel Richardson's maternal cordial promised smooth births and healthy infants, while Mrs. Hartwell's nursing mother's friend assured plentiful milk and calm temperaments. These goods contained enormous opium levels, often surpassing concentrations in remedies marketed to the general populace. The makers knew pregnancy and birth created captive audiences of women desperate for relief from bodily and emotional torment. Helena Blackwood learned this during her fourth pregnancy in 1862. After 3 hard labors that had left her weakened and worried, Helena's doctor suggested Dr. Richardson's blend to guarantee an easier delivery. The remedy seemed wondrous during her gestation, banishing the queasiness and mood swings that had marred her prior experiences. Helena felt peaceful and assured, convinced she had at last found the key to easy motherhood. But when Helena's daughter arrived, the baby showed odd behaviors no one could clarify. Little Margaret would shriek for hours without clear reason, her tiny frame stiff with strain that nothing seemed to ease. She refused to feed properly, averting from her mother's breast with apparent distress. Most troubling, the infant appeared to have fits where she shook uncontrollably, her face twisting as if in agony. The family doctor blamed these signs on a nervous disposition inherited from Helena's fragile build. He advised continuing the maternal cordial through nursing to ensure Helena's milk carried soothing qualities to her restless baby. What he didn't grasp was that baby Margaret was enduring withdrawal from opium received via the placenta, and that persisting Helena's medication would only continue the infant's habit through breast milk. This mournful loop repeated in nurseries worldwide as whole families became unwittingly reliant on opium. Mothers would dose to handle childcare demands, unintentionally drugging their nursing babies. When these infants grew fussy or hard, mothers would up their own remedy or start giving children direct portions of proprietary remedies marketed for baby use. The most favored of these child blends was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which held enough morphine to tranquilize an adult male. Ads for the item showed cherubic children slumbering peacefully as their thankful mothers gazed on contentedly. The ad text vowed the syrup would hush fretful babies instantly, letting weary mothers rest and tend other tasks without endless disruption. What the ads omitted was that babies given regular portions of these soothing syrups often died asleep, victims of breathing suppression from opiate overdose. When infants yielded to these remedies, their deaths were usually blamed on sudden sickness or weak builds rather than drug poisoning. The pattern was so common that Victorian families often anticipated losing several children to mysterious ailments in early years. Martha Cromwell lost 3 infants to what doctors called failure to thrive, each death happening months after starting treatment with various proprietary remedies for colic and unrest. Martha never linked her baby's deaths to the medications she had lovingly given, believing instead she was cursed with especially delicate children. She continued using the same blends with each new pregnancy, unknowingly repeating the cycle of habit and death. The pharmaceutical companies making these products were fully aware of their lethal potential. Internal letters from the era reveal discussions about optimal dosing levels that would sedate children without causing obvious overdose symptoms. Company executives calculated acceptable mortality rates, understanding that some infant deaths were inevitable consequences of their marketing strategies, but considering them acceptable losses in pursuit of profits. When public health officials occasionally raised concerns about infant mortality rates in areas with high patent medicine consumption, manufacturers deployed sophisticated public relations campaigns to deflect responsibility. They funded medical studies that attributed infant deaths to poor sanitation, inadequate nutrition, or genetic weaknesses. They sponsored educational programs that taught mothers to recognize signs of infant illness while carefully avoiding any mention of medication-related symptoms. The most insidious aspect of pediatric opium marketing was how it normalized drug dependence from birth. Children who survived their early exposure to these medicines often developed lifelong cravings for opiate substances. They would seek out laudanum as teenagers for minor ailments, having learned from infancy that chemical solutions were preferable to natural discomfort. Thomas Whitfield, born to a laudanum-addicted mother and dosed with soothing syrups throughout his infancy, began stealing his mother's medicine at age 14. He had discovered that small amounts of laudanum eliminated the mysterious aches and restlessness that had plagued him since childhood, not understanding that these symptoms were actually withdrawal effects from the opium he had consumed as a baby. By the time Thomas reached adulthood, he was purchasing laudanum in quantities that shocked even experienced apothecaries. His tolerance, developed through years of intermittent exposure beginning in the womb, allowed him to consume doses that would have killed other young men. He moved through a series of jobs and relationships, unable to maintain stability while battling an addiction he had never chosen to acquire. Thomas's story was repeated countless times throughout the Victorian era as children born into opium-saturated households grew up to become the next generation of addicts. The pharmaceutical industry had essentially created a self-perpetuating market by ensuring that addiction would pass from parent to child like a hereditary disease. The international scope of the laudanum trade created additional complications for families trying to understand or address addiction problems. Opium poppies cultivated in Turkey, India, and China were processed into various preparations in European laboratories, then shipped worldwide with minimal regulation or quality control. The same base ingredients might be formulated into dozens of different products with wildly varying potencies. Isabella Pembroke discovered this dangerous variability during a family trip to continental Europe in 1868. Having maintained her laudanum addiction for several years using consistent British preparations, Isabella found herself in crisis when her usual medicines proved unavailable in French apothecaries. The laudanum she purchased in Paris was significantly stronger than what she was accustomed to, leading to an accidental overdose that left her unconscious for 2 days. Isabella's husband, still unaware of the true nature of her condition, summoned local physicians who diagnosed her collapse as a severe attack of nervous exhaustion brought on by travel fatigue. They prescribed additional opium-based medicines to restore her strength, inadvertently worsening her already dangerous level of intoxication. Isabella spent the remainder of their European vacation in a semi-conscious state, her family attributing her condition to the delicate health that had always required careful medical management. The lack of standardization in international drug manufacturing created a deadly lottery for addicted women who found themselves away from their usual suppliers. German preparations might be twice as strong as English equivalents, while Italian formulations could be diluted with alcohol that created additional complications. Women who traveled frequently learned to carry extensive supplies of their preferred medicines. But luggage limitations and customs inspections often forced them to rely on local products with unpredictable results. The diplomatic immunity enjoyed by wealthy foreign visitors complicated efforts to track or address laudanum deaths that occurred during international travel. When prominent English ladies died mysteriously in foreign hotels or sanitariums, their bodies were typically returned home quickly with death certificates citing natural causes. The true circumstances of these deaths remained hidden behind veils of national pride and social propriety. Lady Catherine Worthington's death in a Swiss spa exemplified this pattern of international cover-up. Having traveled to the Alps seeking treatment for nervous exhaustion, Lady Catherine was found dead in her hotel suite, surrounded by empty medicine bottles from multiple countries. The Swiss authorities, eager to avoid scandal that might damage their lucrative health tourism industry, certified her death as resulting from heart failure and arranged for immediate repatriation of her remains. The English press reported Lady Catherine's death as a tragic loss of a devoted mother and charitable benefactor who had succumbed to long-standing health problems while seeking the latest medical treatments abroad. Her funeral was attended by members of Parliament and foreign dignitaries, none of whom suspected that they were mourning a woman who had died from a massive opium overdose. These international incidents highlighted the global nature of the laudanum epidemic, demonstrating that opium addiction transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. Wealthy women from every developed nation were falling victim to the same dangerous medicines, and their deaths were being concealed by the same elaborate networks of professional and social complicity. The religious community's response to the laudanum epidemic revealed deep contradictions within Victorian moral frameworks. While churches preached against the evils of alcohol and tobacco, they remained largely silent about patent medicines that were destroying their female parishioners. This selective blindness reflected both genuine ignorance about addiction and deliberate avoidance of issues that might challenge comfortable assumptions about feminine virtue. Reverend William Hartwell faced this moral dilemma directly when his own wife Margaret began exhibiting obvious signs of laudanum dependence. Margaret had started taking Dr. Morrison's nerve tonic after the birth of their youngest child, claiming it helped her maintain the energy needed for her extensive church duties. But Reverend Hartwell gradually noticed that his wife's periods of charitable enthusiasm alternated with episodes of withdrawn lethargy that seemed to coincide with her medicine schedule. As a man of God, Reverend Hartwell believed that addiction was fundamentally a spiritual failing that could be overcome through prayer and moral discipline. He spent hours counseling his wife about the importance of self-control and the dangers of relying on earthly substances rather than divine strength. But his theological approach to what was actually a medical condition only increased Margaret's shame and desperation. Margaret began hiding her medicine consumption from her husband, taking doses in the church vestry before services, and keeping bottles concealed in her Bible case during pastoral visits. The secrecy required to maintain her addiction while fulfilling her role as a minister's wife created additional psychological pressure that accelerated her decline. When Margaret finally collapsed during a women's prayer meeting, convulsing and foaming at the mouth in front of the entire congregation, Reverend Hartwell was forced to confront the reality of his wife's condition. But even then, he interpreted her overdose as a spiritual crisis rather than a medical emergency, calling for prayer circles and fasting rather than medical intervention. Margaret survived that particular episode, but her public collapse had shattered the carefully maintained fiction of her virtue and piety. Congregation members began whispering about the minister's wife who had lost control of herself during worship, and several families started attending other churches to avoid the embarrassment of association with scandal. The religious community's inability to address addiction honestly forced many suffering women to choose between their faith and their health. They could confess their struggles and face condemnation as moral failures, or they could maintain their addictions in secret while participating in religious activities that emphasized the very self-control they had lost. Some women found refuge in religious communities that took more compassionate approaches to human weakness. The Society of Friends, known as Quakers, developed an early understanding of addiction as a medical rather than moral problem, offering support and treatment rather than judgment. But these progressive religious groups represented small minorities within predominantly punitive theological frameworks. The economic pressures created by laudanum addiction often forced women into increasingly desperate measures to fund their drug purchases. As tolerance levels rose and required doses became more expensive, many women found themselves consuming significant portions of household budgets on medicine without their husband's knowledge. Constance Fairfax developed an elaborate system of financial deception to support her escalating laudanum consumption. She would purchase expensive household items from merchants who agreed to inflate their invoices, then return the goods for cash refunds that she used to buy medicine. She convinced tradespeople to bill her husband for services never rendered, keeping the payments for her own use. Most ingeniously, she began hosting charity fundraising events where she would skim donations intended for orphanages and hospitals. Constance's financial manipulations worked for nearly 2 years before her husband discovered discrepancies in their household accounts. By that time, she had embezzled hundreds of pounds from various sources, creating debts that threatened to destroy her family's social standing and financial security. When confronted with evidence of her theft, Constance broke down and confessed not only to the financial crimes, but to the laudanum addiction that had driven her to desperate measures. Her husband, a respected banker who had built his reputation on financial integrity, faced the impossible choice between exposing his wife's crimes and covering up behavior that violated everything he claimed to believe about honesty and moral responsibility. The family ultimately chose concealment over justice, repaying the stolen funds and fabricating explanations for the financial irregularities. Constance was quietly sent to a private sanitarium where she could receive treatment away from public scrutiny. but the shame and stress of her exposure triggered a final overdose that ended her life within weeks of her admission. The pattern of financial crime driven by laudanum addiction was far more common than Victorian society ever acknowledged. Women who had never contemplated dishonesty found themselves stealing from their children's education funds, pawning family heirlooms, and manipulating household accounts to support drug habits they couldn't control. The shame associated with these crimes was often worse than the physical effects of the addiction itself. Women who had defined themselves through their moral virtue found that laudanum dependence had transformed them into thieves and liars, destroying their self-concept along with their health. Mary Elizabeth Thornton, a judge's daughter who had always prided herself on her impeccable character, began her descent into financial crime by taking small amounts from her household allowance to purchase extra medicine. But as her tolerance increased and her needs became more expensive, she progressed to forging her father's signature on bank drafts and selling family jewelry without permission. When Mary Elizabeth was finally caught attempting to pawn her grandmother's silver tea service, the family scandal was so overwhelming that she attempted suicide rather than face the consequences of her actions. She survived the overdose that was meant to end her life, but the brain damage caused by oxygen deprivation left her permanently impaired and institutionalized. The intersection of laudanum addiction and Victorian marriage laws created particularly tragic situations for women whose husbands discovered their drug dependence. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, married women had no independent legal identity and could be committed to asylums or treatment facilities entirely at their husband's discretion. Some husbands used these legal powers compassionately, seeking the best available treatment for wives they genuinely wanted to help. But others saw addiction as grounds for disposing of inconvenient spouses, using medical commitment as a socially acceptable form of divorce that preserved their reputations while eliminating their domestic responsibilities. Vivian Blackstone discovered this harsh reality when her husband learned about her laudanum use through servants' gossip. Rather than offering support or seeking medical consultation, Mr. Blackstone immediately began proceedings to have Vivian declared mentally incompetent and committed to a private asylum. He claimed that her drug use proved she was incapable of rational thought and posed a danger to their children's moral development. The commitment hearing was a travesty of justice that highlighted the legal powerlessness of Victorian women. Vivian was not permitted to speak in her own defense or to call witnesses who might testify to her competence. Her husband's word, supported by a family physician who had examined her while she was heavily sedated, was sufficient to strip her of all legal rights and consign her to indefinite institutional confinement. Vivian spent the final 8 years of her life in Brookhaven Asylum, a private facility that specialized in housing inconvenient family members from wealthy households. She was kept continuously medicated with the same laudanum that had destroyed her freedom, ostensibly to prevent the violent outbursts that never actually occurred. Her husband remarried within a year of her commitment, telling friends that his first wife had succumbed to hereditary mental illness that made remarriage a sad necessity. The asylum records from Brookhaven and similar institutions revealed hundreds of women who had been committed primarily for laudanum addiction rather than genuine mental illness. These facilities functioned as dumping grounds for families who wanted to avoid the scandal of public addiction treatment or divorce proceedings. The conditions in these private asylums were often worse than those in public institutions, because wealthy families paid premium fees for discretion rather than quality care. Women were kept isolated from outside contact, denied visitors who might question their treatment, and subjected to experimental therapies that often worsened their conditions. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, medical director of the prestigious Millbrook Sanitarium, developed what he called the exhaustion cure for female patients suffering from laudanum addiction. His treatment involved administering massive doses of opium to induce profound unconsciousness, then gradually reducing the medication while the patient remained sedated. The theory was that women could be weaned from addiction while unconscious, avoiding the psychological distress of withdrawal. In practice, Zimmermann's exhaustion cure killed more patients than it helped. Women would slip into comas from which they never awakened, or would emerge from sedation so brain damaged that they required permanent institutional care. But the treatment continued for years, because families were desperate for any solution that promised to restore their loved ones' respectability. The few women who survived these experimental treatments and eventually gained release from private asylums often found that their years of institutionalization had destroyed any possibility of returning to normal life. They had lost touch with their children, who had been told their mothers were dead, and had been replaced in their social circles by women who had maintained their reputations intact. Elizabeth Harrington spent 6 years at Millbrook after being committed for laudanum addiction, emerging finally when her husband's business failures made continued private treatment financially impossible. She returned to a world where her teenage children no longer recognized her. Her friends had forgotten her existence, and her position in society had been permanently forfeited. Elizabeth's attempts to rebuild her life were hampered by the social stigma of having been institutionalized and by the physical damage caused by years of experimental treatment. She had lost most of her teeth, suffered from chronic tremors, and experienced memory problems that made complex tasks impossible. Most tragically, she had developed an even more severe addiction to the medications used during her treatment, leaving her worse off than when she had first sought help. The stories of these institutional survivors were rarely told because the women themselves were too damaged or ashamed to speak publicly about their experiences. But their silent suffering represented the ultimate failure of Victorian society's approach to laudanum addiction, demonstrating how medical ignorance and social prejudice could transform treatable conditions into lifetime tragedies. The international trade networks that supplied opium to Victorian consumers created opportunities for particularly unscrupulous operators to exploit addicted women. Smugglers and black market dealers recognized that wealthy ladies represented lucrative customers who would pay premium prices for reliable supplies of high-quality drugs. Captain James Morrison, a former East India Company officer, established a sophisticated distribution network that supplied laudanum to upper-class women throughout London and the surrounding counties. Morrison's operation was disguised as a legitimate import business, dealing in exotic spices and medicinal herbs. But his real profits came from the pure opium he smuggled in specially designed containers that escaped customs inspection. Morrison's customers included the wives of members of parliament, prominent businessmen, and high-ranking military officers. He maintained detailed records of their purchases, using this information both to track their escalating consumption and to ensure their continued silence about his illegal activities. Women who attempted to reduce their purchases or seek alternative suppliers would receive anonymous letters reminding them of the social consequences that would follow if their addiction became public knowledge. The blackmail aspect of Morrison's business model reflected the vulnerability of laudanum-addicted women to criminal exploitation. Their desperate need for reliable drug supplies combined with their terror of social exposure made them perfect victims for unscrupulous dealers who understood how to leverage shame for profit. Margaret Ashworth became trapped in Morrison's web when her usual sources of laudanum proved inadequate for her escalating needs. Morrison promised to provide stronger preparations at reasonable prices, but gradually increased his charges while reducing the quality of his products. When Margaret protested, Morrison threatened to inform her husband about her purchases unless she agreed to recruit other customers from her social circle. Margaret found herself acting as Morrison's agent, introducing other addicted women to his services while receiving free supplies for her own use. The moral degradation of becoming a drug dealer while maintaining her facade as a respectable society matron accelerated Margaret's psychological deterioration and deepened her self-loathing. The criminal network surrounding the laudanum trade often employed violence against customers who attempted to escape their control or who threatened to expose their operations. Women who tried to report dealers to authorities would find themselves facing counter-accusations about their own illegal drug purchases, creating legal complications that discouraged official intervention. When Sarah Payton attempted to testify against the dealer who had been supplying her with adulterated laudanum, she discovered that her own medical records had been subpoenaed to demonstrate her history of drug dependence. The prospect of having her addiction revealed in open court terrified Sarah so completely that she withdrew her complaint and returned to purchasing from the same criminal who had been cheating her. This cycle of exploitation and intimidation kept many dangerous dealers in business for years, protected by their customers' fear of exposure. The legal system's inability to distinguish between victims and criminals in drug-related cases meant that addicted women received punishment rather than help when their situations came to official attention. The laudanum epidemic's impact on Victorian literature and arts has been largely overlooked, but many prominent female writers and artists of the era struggled with opium addiction that profoundly influenced their creative work. The drug's effects on perception and emotion created distinctive artistic styles that reflected both the euphoria and despair of chronic intoxication. Christina Rossetti, though her addiction was never publicly acknowledged during her lifetime, produced poetry that clearly reflected the experiences of laudanum dependence. Her verses about lost time, fractured memories, and overwhelming yearning resonated powerfully with other addicted women who recognized their own experiences in her carefully crafted metaphors. The artistic community's romanticization of opium use, inspired partly by Samuel Taylor Coleridge's famous accounts of drug-induced creativity, provided cover for female artists whose addiction was destroying their lives and work. Critics and patrons interpreted erratic behavior and declining productivity as artistic temperament rather than recognizing the signs of substance abuse. Millicent Hartwell, a talented painter whose work was beginning to gain recognition in London galleries, saw her career destroyed by laudanum addiction that gradually robbed her of the manual dexterity and visual acuity necessary for detailed artistic work. Her later paintings, created while heavily medicated, showed dramatic deterioration in technique and composition, but contemporary critics praised them as examples of bold new artistic movements. Millicent's family, proud of her artistic achievements and unwilling to acknowledge that her success had been built on drug-fueled productivity, continued supporting her career even as her addiction became increasingly obvious. They funded studio space, purchased expensive materials, and arranged exhibitions of work that showed clear evidence of impairment, maintaining the fiction that Millicent was developing innovative artistic techniques rather than losing control of her abilities. The tragic irony of laudanum's impact on female creativity was that the drug initially enhanced artistic perception and emotional intensity, allowing women to produce work of unusual power and originality. But this creative flowering was inevitably followed by decline and eventual artistic death as addiction progressed and tolerance levels rose. Many promising female artists and writers of the Victorian era simply vanished from public view after brief periods of recognition, their disappearances attributed to marriage, family obligations, or loss of artistic inspiration. But examination of private papers and family records suggests that laudanum addiction was the real cause of many interrupted careers, as talented women found themselves unable to continue creative work while battling drug dependence. The loss of these artistic voices represented a cultural tragedy that Victorian society never acknowledged, as an entire generation of female creativity was sacrificed to the laudanum epidemic that continued claiming victims in drawing rooms and artist studios across the civilized world. The publishing world of Victorian England became an unwitting accomplice in the laudanum epidemic through its promotion of female invalidism as a literary ideal. Novels of the era consistently portrayed frail, ethereal heroines whose delicate constitutions required constant medical attention, creating a cultural template that real women felt pressured to emulate. Publishers discovered that stories featuring beautiful suffering ladies resonated powerfully with female readers, many of whom were themselves struggling with the very conditions these fictional characters romanticized. Emma Whitfield, an aspiring novelist from Bath, found herself trapped between literary ambition and laudanum dependence in ways that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. Emma had begun taking Dr. Morrison's nervous remedy after reading serialized stories in the Ladies' Home Journal about sensitive heroines who required opiate medicines to function in harsh, unfeeling worlds. The fictional characters seemed to offer a roadmap for transforming personal suffering into artistic authenticity. Emma's early writing, produced during the honeymoon phase of her laudanum use, possessed an otherworldly quality that impressed editors and readers alike. Her descriptions of emotional pain carried the vivid intensity of lived experience, while her depictions of feminine fragility resonated with women who recognized their own struggles in her carefully crafted prose. Publishers praised her work as representing the finest traditions of female literary sensibility. But as Emma's tolerance increased and her doses escalated, her writing began to reflect the darker realities of addiction rather than its initial euphoric effects. Her characters became increasingly passive and disconnected, spending entire chapters in dreamlike states that mirrored Emma's own drug-induced stupors. Her once precise prose became rambling and repetitive, filled with half-completed thoughts and circular reasoning that reflected her deteriorating mental clarity. The publishing industry's response to Emma's declining work quality revealed how completely they misunderstood the connection between laudanum use and artistic production. Editors interpreted her increasingly incoherent manuscripts as examples of experimental literary techniques, praising her bold departure from conventional narrative structures. They encouraged Emma to explore these new directions, unknowingly pushing her toward even more extreme drug use as she struggled to recapture the creative insights that had made her early work so compelling. Emma's final manuscript, submitted just weeks before her death from an accidental overdose, consisted largely of disconnected fragments and incomplete sentences that made no coherent sense. Yet her publisher released it posthumously as her masterpiece, claiming that Emma had transcended traditional literary forms to create something entirely new. Critics hailed the work as a breakthrough in feminine expression, never realizing they were celebrating the literary equivalent of a suicide note. The domestic service industry became another hidden casualty of the laudanum epidemic, as household staff found themselves managing employers whose drug use created impossible working conditions. Servants were expected to maintain normal household routines while their mistresses existed in varying states of opiate intoxication, creating daily crises that required constant improvisation and discretion. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, head housekeeper for the prominent Blackwood family, developed an intimate understanding of laudanum addiction through years of managing Lady Blackwood's increasingly erratic behavior. Eleanor learned to recognize the signs that indicated when her mistress had taken too much medicine, when she needed assistance walking without falling, and when she should be left alone to avoid triggering paranoid episodes. The moral burden placed on servants like Eleanor was enormous and largely unacknowledged. They were required to enable their employers' addictions through purchasing medicines, concealing evidence of drug use from other family members, and maintaining household functions when their mistresses were too intoxicated to provide direction. Yet they were also expected to maintain absolute loyalty and discretion, never discussing their employer's conditions with anyone outside the household. Eleanor's detailed diaries, discovered decades after her death, provided unprecedented insight into the daily reality of living with laudanum addiction. She described mornings when Lady Blackwood would be found unconscious in her sitting room, afternoons when she would mistake servants for deceased relatives, and evenings when she would become convinced that intruders were hiding throughout the house. The physical dangers posed by heavily medicated employers created constant anxiety for household staff, who understood they could be blamed for any accidents or incidents that occurred under their watch. Eleanor wrote about nights spent sitting outside Lady Blackwood's bedroom door, listening for signs of distress that might indicate an overdose requiring immediate intervention. She described the terror of finding her mistress unresponsive, never knowing whether to call for medical help and risk exposing the family's secret, or to wait and hope that Lady Blackwood would regain consciousness naturally. The economic relationship between servants and addicted employers created additional complications that trapped both parties in cycles of dysfunction. Lady Blackwood paid Eleanor significantly above normal wages, understanding that her discretion and specialized care were worth premium compensation. But this financial dependence made it impossible for Eleanor to seek other employment, even when Lady Blackwood's condition became dangerous for everyone in the household. Eleanor's position required her to become expert in managing laudanum overdoses, recognizing withdrawal symptoms, and providing basic medical care when physicians weren't available. She learned to dilute excessively strong doses, to hide medicines when Lady Blackwood had already consumed dangerous amounts, and to fabricate explanations for her mistress's condition when visitors arrived unexpectedly. The psychological toll of this responsibility was devastating for servants who genuinely cared about their employers, but felt powerless to help them recover. Eleanor wrote movingly about watching Lady Blackwood's gradual transformation from an intelligent, accomplished woman into a hollow shell who existed only to consume her next dose of medicine. The grief of witnessing this decline, combined with the impossibility of discussing it with anyone, created a form of isolation that many servants found unbearable. Some household staff attempted to intervene by diluting their mistress's medicines or hiding bottles to force periods of abstinence. But these well-intentioned efforts usually backfired, creating withdrawal crises that were interpreted as evidence of worsening health conditions requiring even stronger medications. Servants who were discovered tampering with medicines faced immediate dismissal without references, making such interventions professionally suicidal. The network of servants working for laudanum-addicted employers developed its own informal communication system, sharing information about effective management strategies and warning each other about particularly dangerous situations. These networks represented one of the few sources of support available to people dealing directly with the realities of Victorian opium addiction. But they operated in complete secrecy to protect both servants and employers from social exposure. The children of laudanum-addicted mothers developed survival strategies that would shape their approach to relationships and authority for the rest of their lives. They learned to function as amateur physicians, recognizing the difference between their mother's various states of intoxication and understanding when adult intervention might be necessary to prevent medical emergencies. Young Timothy Ashworth became expert at managing his mother's laudanum addiction by age 10, having learned through painful experience that his survival depended on accurately reading her condition and responding appropriately. When his mother had taken too much medicine, Timothy would help her to bed and monitor her breathing until the danger passed. When she was experiencing withdrawal, he would bring her tea and remain nearby to provide comfort during the worst symptoms. Timothy's childhood responsibilities included tasks that no child should have been asked to perform. He learned to forge his mother's handwriting to write excuses for missed social obligations, to lie convincingly to visitors about his mother's whereabouts, and to manage household finances when his mother was too impaired to handle money responsibly. Most tragically, he became skilled at hiding evidence of his mother's condition from his father, understanding instinctively that family stability depended on maintaining elaborate deceptions. The hypervigilance required for these responsibilities created lasting psychological changes that affected Timothy's development well into adulthood. He became unable to relax completely, always scanning his environment for signs of crisis or danger. He developed an exaggerated sense of responsibility for other people's emotional states, believing that he could prevent disasters through careful attention and appropriate intervention. Timothy's relationship with his mother was complicated by the fact that her personality changed dramatically depending on her medication status. The warm, attentive woman who existed during brief periods of optimal dosing was replaced by either a hostile stranger during withdrawal or an unconscious invalid during overdose episodes. Timothy learned to treasure the rare moments when his real mother was accessible, while protecting himself emotionally from the unpredictable person she became under other circumstances. The educational neglect experienced by children of addicted mothers created long-term disadvantages that extended far beyond childhood. Timothy's formal schooling was frequently interrupted by family crises that required his presence at home, and his academic performance suffered from the chronic stress and sleep deprivation that characterized his daily existence. Teachers who might have recognized his potential instead saw a distracted, anxious child who seemed unable to focus on lessons. The social isolation imposed on these children was equally damaging. Timothy couldn't invite friends to his home because his mother's condition was unpredictable, and he couldn't discuss his family situation with peers because the shame and secrecy surrounding addiction made honest communication impossible. He grew up believing that his experiences were unique and shameful, never realizing that many other children in his social circle were dealing with similar challenges. Some children of addicted mothers became advocates for temperance and drug regulation as adults, channeling their childhood trauma into efforts to prevent other families from experiencing similar destruction. But many more developed their own substance abuse problems, having learned from early childhood that chemicals provided reliable solutions to emotional distress. The marriage patterns of laudanum-addicted women created multi-generational cycles of dysfunction that affected entire family trees. Women who had learned to use opium as a coping mechanism for marital difficulties often chose partners who were either unaware of their addiction or who were themselves struggling with substance abuse problems. Charlotte Peyton's marriage to William Ashford exemplified this tragic pattern. Charlotte had begun using laudanum during her first marriage to manage the emotional trauma of domestic violence, and the drug had provided the only relief she could find from her husband's unpredictable rages. When her first husband died suddenly, Charlotte believed she had escaped the circumstances that required her medication, but she discovered that her physical dependence on opium had become independent of the original trauma. Charlotte's courtship with William was conducted entirely during periods when her laudanum use was carefully managed, presenting him with a version of herself that bore little resemblance to her true condition. She was charming, vivacious, and seemingly healthy during their carefully choreographed encounters, having learned to time her doses to coincide with social activities. William, a widower seeking a companion for his later years, was enchanted by Charlotte's apparent vitality and social grace. He interpreted her occasional moments of distraction or unusual behavior as endearing feminine mystique, rather than recognizing the signs of drug intoxication. Their wedding was celebrated as a perfect match between two mature individuals who had found second chances at happiness. The reality of married life quickly shattered these romantic illusions. Charlotte's need for privacy to manage her medication schedule created immediate tensions as William couldn't understand why his new wife required so much time alone in her chambers. Her mood swings, which had been carefully concealed during courtship, became impossible to hide during daily cohabitation. William's attempts to be a caring husband often interfered with Charlotte's drug management routines, creating conflicts that neither of them understood. When he suggested activities that conflicted with her dosing schedule, she would become anxious and irritable. When he planned trips that might limit her access to medicines, she would develop mysterious illnesses that required them to remain at home. The gradual revelation of Charlotte's addiction destroyed William's trust and left him feeling deceived and manipulated. He had entered the marriage believing he was caring for a delicate woman who needed gentle protection, only to discover that his wife was battling a condition he couldn't comprehend or control. The shame of acknowledging that he had been deceived made it impossible for William to seek advice or support from friends or family members. Charlotte's addiction progressed rapidly under the stress of trying to maintain her marriage while managing her drug dependence. The additional pressure of concealing her condition from someone who lived in intimate proximity pushed her toward higher doses and more frequent administration. She began experiencing withdrawal symptoms during normal daily activities, making it impossible to function as the wife William expected her to be. The financial strain of Charlotte's drug purchases created another source of marital conflict. William noticed discrepancies in household accounts, but attributed them to feminine frivolity rather than understanding their true cause. When confronted about missing money, Charlotte would fabricate elaborate explanations about expensive purchases or unexpected household expenses. The sexual dimension of their marriage became particularly problematic as Charlotte's addiction progressed. The opium affected her ability to experience physical pleasure or emotional intimacy, making marital relations feel mechanical and distressing. William interpreted her lack of responsiveness as rejection, never understanding that his wife was chemically incapable of the emotional connection he desired. Charlotte's final years were marked by increasingly desperate attempts to manage both her addiction and her marriage simultaneously. She would take massive doses of laudanum before social events to appear normal and happy, then suffer severe withdrawal symptoms in private. While William remained unaware of her condition, the physical and emotional toll of this constant performance eventually proved unsustainable. When Charlotte died from an accidental overdose, William was left not only with grief, but with crushing guilt about his failure to recognize or address his wife's suffering. The discovery of hidden laudanum bottles throughout their home forced him to confront the reality that his second marriage had been built on deception and illness, rather than the mutual affection he had believed they shared. The social rituals surrounding death and mourning in Victorian society provided final opportunities for concealing the true impact of laudanum addiction. Funeral customs that emphasized the deceased's virtue and piety made it easy to transform drug-related deaths into stories of spiritual triumph over physical suffering. The elaborate funeral preparations for Lady Margaret Thornton became a masterpiece of posthumous reputation management. Margaret had died after consuming what her maid later described as enough laudanum to kill several people. But her family presented her death as the peaceful conclusion of a long struggle with nervous exhaustion. Margaret's body was displayed in her finest silk gown, her face carefully arranged to suggest serene acceptance of divine will rather than the rictus of opium poisoning that had characterized her actual death. Cosmetics concealed the yellowed complexion and sunken features that had marked her final years, while strategic lighting minimized the physical evidence of chronic drug abuse. The funeral service emphasized Margaret's patience in bearing suffering, her devotion to charitable causes, and her exemplary fulfillment of feminine duties. The minister spoke movingly about her gentle spirit and unwavering faith, constructing a narrative of noble endurance that bore no resemblance to the desperate addiction that had actually claimed her life. Margaret's husband commissioned an elaborate memorial stone that described her as a loving wife and mother, who had been called home after years of faithful service to family and community. The inscription made no reference to the medicine bottles found clutched in her hands, or to the suicide note discovered in her writing desk expressing her despair about her inability to overcome her dependence on laudanum. The mourners who attended Margaret's funeral included dozens of women who were themselves struggling with similar addictions. But the social codes governing such gatherings prevented any acknowledgement of shared experience. They stood in silent solidarity, recognizing their own fate in Margaret's carefully sanitized death, while maintaining the public fiction that such tragedies were rare and inexplicable. The newspaper obituaries that appeared following these funerals developed their own coded language for describing laudanum-related deaths. Phrases like, "after a long illness borne with Christian fortitude," or "succumbed to nervous exhaustion," became standard euphemisms that informed readers about the true cause of death, while maintaining plausible deniability. The memorial practices surrounding these deaths served to perpetuate the very conditions that had caused them. By transforming addiction into martyrdom and overdose into peaceful transition, Victorian society avoided confronting the systematic problems that were destroying its female population. Each funeral became another opportunity to reinforce the deadly fiction that laudanum use was both normal and virtuous. The economic impact of the laudanum epidemic extended far beyond the pharmaceutical industry, creating ripple effects that influenced everything from domestic service wages to inheritance patterns. Families dealing with addicted members found themselves managing financial crises that threatened their long-term stability and social position. The Blackwood family's economic decline illustrated how laudanum addiction could destroy even substantial fortunes over time. Lady Blackwood's escalating drug consumption had required increasingly creative financing methods, beginning with small deceptions about household expenses and eventually progressing to major financial manipulations that compromised the family's entire estate. By the height of her addiction, Lady Blackwood was spending more on laudanum than the family allocated for all other household expenses combined. Her husband's business income, substantial by any reasonable measure, proved inadequate to support both their normal lifestyle and her pharmaceutical requirements. The family began borrowing against future earnings, then mortgaging properties, and finally liquidating investments to maintain the cash flow necessary for Lady Blackwood's drug purchases. The secrecy surrounding her addiction meant that these financial decisions were made without proper consultation or planning. Mr. Blackwood attributed their mounting debts to general economic difficulties rather than understanding that his wife's medical expenses were consuming their capital. He made increasingly risky investment decisions in desperate attempts to restore their financial position, often worsening their situation through speculation and poor judgment. The social pressure to maintain appearances while managing financial crisis created additional stress that affected every family member. The Blackwoods continued hosting elaborate dinner parties and funding their children's expensive educations while privately struggling to meet basic obligations. Servants' wages were delayed, suppliers' bills went unpaid, and creditors grew increasingly insistent. But the family maintained the fiction of continued prosperity. Lady Blackwood's death from an overdose came at a moment when the family faced complete financial ruin. Her funeral expenses, paid for with borrowed money, represented the final drain on resources that had been systematically depleted over years of hidden addiction. Mr. Blackwood discovered after her death that they owed substantial sums to dozens of creditors, many of whom had been providing goods and services under false assumptions about the family's financial stability. The children of laudanum-addicted mothers often inherited not only their mother's debts, but also their psychological predisposition toward substance abuse. Young Edward Blackwood, who had spent his teenage years watching his family's mysterious financial decline, began drinking heavily as soon as he left home for university. His alcoholism developed as a coping mechanism for childhood trauma and created new financial drains that perpetuated the cycle of addiction and economic instability. The marriage prospects of children from laudanum-affected families were often severely compromised by both financial constraints and social suspicions about hereditary weakness. Potential suitors and their families would investigate carefully before committing to unions with families that had experienced mysterious illnesses or unexplained financial difficulties. The insurance industry began developing crude actuarial models that identified families with histories of female nervous disorders as poor risks for life insurance policies. These calculations, based on statistical correlations rather than medical understanding, effectively penalized families dealing with laudanum addiction by making it difficult to obtain financial protection against further losses. The legal profession developed specialized expertise in managing the complex estate issues created by laudanum-related deaths. Lawyers learned to identify the signs of drug-related financial manipulation and developed strategies for protecting surviving family members from creditors who might have been unknowingly enabling addictive behaviors through extended credit arrangements. The banking industry's response to the laudanum epidemic revealed both the scope of the problem and society's continued denial of its existence. Bank managers began recognizing patterns of account activity that suggested customer drug addiction, but they developed policies designed to protect institutional interests rather than to help struggling families address underlying problems. Private banks serving wealthy clientele noticed increasing numbers of female customers who made frequent small withdrawals that didn't correspond to normal household expense patterns. These women would visit multiple branches, often accompanied by servants, to conduct transactions that seemed designed to avoid attracting attention to their total withdrawal amounts. Bank officers learned to recognize the physical signs of laudanum intoxication in customers who arrived to conduct business while heavily medicated. They developed procedures for handling clients who seemed confused about transaction amounts, or who signed documents with obviously impaired judgment. But these protective measures were designed to limit institutional liability rather than to provide assistance to customers who were clearly struggling with serious problems. The correspondence between banks and their laudanum-addicted customers revealed the elaborate deceptions required to maintain addiction while preserving social respectability. Women would write detailed letters explaining unusual account activity, creating fictional expenses, and fabricating financial emergencies to justify their frequent need for cash. Mrs. Penelope Ashworth's letters to her private banker provided a masterclass in the creative accounting required to fund laudanum addiction without arousing suspicion. She described non-existent home repairs, fictional medical expenses for imaginary relatives, and elaborate charity commitments that supposedly required regular cash donations. Her banker, recognizing the implausibility of her explanations but reluctant to challenge a valued customer, simply processed her requests while maintaining careful records that documented the progression of her financial deception. The banking industry's files contained hundreds of similar cases, representing a hidden archive of the laudanum epidemic's financial impact. These records, preserved in institutional vaults long after the customers had died, provided statistical evidence of addiction's prevalence among upper-class Victorian women. But the information remained buried in confidential business files, never contributing to public understanding of the crisis. The international banking networks that served wealthy Victorian families created opportunities for particularly sophisticated financial manipulations designed to conceal drug-related expenses. Women could transfer funds between accounts in different countries, ostensibly for travel or investment purposes, while actually financing laudanum purchases that would be difficult to trace through normal channels. Lady Catherine Morrison developed an elaborate system of international transfers that allowed her to purchase opium through foreign suppliers without creating obvious connections to her domestic financial activities. She would transfer substantial sums to European banks, claiming to be investing in continental business opportunities, then use these funds to purchase drugs through networks of international dealers who specialized in serving wealthy English customers. The complexity of these international arrangements provided perfect cover for addiction-related expenses while creating financial webs that became increasingly difficult to unravel. When Lady Catherine died from an overdose, her executors discovered that she had established accounts in 7 different countries, many of which contained evidence of drug purchases that had been ongoing for years. The foreign exchange aspects of international drug purchases created additional opportunities for financial manipulation that further concealed the true cost of laudanum addiction. Women could claim currency losses to explain missing funds, or could exaggerate the expenses associated with international travel to cover the cost of drugs purchased abroad. The development of international telegraph networks during the Victorian era made it possible to coordinate these complex financial arrangements across vast distances. But the same technology also created new opportunities for discovery when family members or legal authorities began investigating suspicious account activities. The telegraph companies that processed messages related to drug purchases became unwitting participants in the laudanum trade, handling coded communications between addicted customers and their suppliers across national boundaries. The standardized forms used for international telegrams preserved evidence of these transactions in company archives, creating another hidden record of the epidemic's scope and international character. The maritime industry played a crucial role in supplying the international opium trade that fed Victorian laudanum addiction. Ship captains and crew members developed sophisticated smuggling networks that transported drugs alongside legitimate cargo, often with the knowledge and cooperation of customs officials who had been bribed or who simply didn't understand the medical significance of the substances they were allowing to pass through their ports. Captain Andrew Fairfax commanded merchant vessels that traveled regularly between London and various ports in the eastern Mediterranean, where high-quality opium was readily available from Turkish and Syrian suppliers. His ships carried official cargoes of spices, silk, and other luxury goods, but their most profitable cargo consisted of carefully concealed packages of raw opium destined for pharmaceutical manufacturers and private customers throughout England. Captain Fairfax developed relationships with apothecaries and private physicians who would place orders for specific quantities of opium, often requesting particular varieties that were prized for their purity and potency. These medical professionals understood that their wealthy female patients required stronger preparations than were generally available through normal commercial channels, and they were willing to pay premium prices for superior products. The smuggling operations required careful coordination between ship crews, dock workers, and distribution networks that could deliver products to customers without attracting official attention. Captain Fairfax employed a network of servants, delivery men, and shop assistants who could transport drugs from ships to customers while maintaining the appearance of conducting legitimate business. The financial profits from opium smuggling were enormous, often exceeding the returns from legal cargo by substantial margins. A single successful voyage could generate enough income to fund Captain Fairfax's retirement. But the addictive nature of his market created steady demand that made continued smuggling activities irresistibly profitable. The risks associated with drug smuggling were offset by the protection provided by customers' social positions and their desperate need for continued supplies. Wealthy addicted women represented ideal customers because they possessed both the financial resources to pay premium prices and the social influence to protect their suppliers from legal consequences. Captain Fairfax's customer list included the wives of judges, military officers, and government officials who would use their influence to shield him from prosecution if his activities were discovered. The mutual dependence between smuggler and customers created a web of complicity that made enforcement of drug laws virtually impossible within upper-class social circles. The international nature of the opium trade meant that Victorian women could access drugs from suppliers throughout the British Empire and beyond, creating a global market that responded quickly to changes in demand or supply conditions. When political situations disrupted traditional supply routes, new networks would emerge to serve the continuing needs of addicted customers. The Crimean War created temporary shortages of Turkish opium that forced Victorian suppliers to develop alternative sources in India and China. These new supply chains introduced different varieties of opium with varying potencies and effects, creating additional dangers for customers who couldn't accurately gauge the strength of unfamiliar products. The colonial administration's involvement in opium production and distribution created conflicts of interest that compromised efforts to regulate drug use within the empire. British officials who profited from opium cultivation in India were reluctant to support policies that might reduce demand for their products, even when they recognized the social damage caused by widespread addiction. The East India Company's monopoly on opium production created artificial scarcities that drove up prices and encouraged the development of black market alternatives. These unofficial supply networks often provided adulterated or contaminated products that posed additional health risks to consumers who were already vulnerable to overdose and other complications. The medical establishment's relationship with the opium trade revealed fundamental conflicts between professional ethics and commercial interests. Many physicians who publicly condemned opium addiction privately invested in companies that manufactured laudanum and other opiate preparations, creating financial incentives for continued overprescribing. Dr. William Hartwell maintained a respectable medical practice that specialized in treating nervous disorders among wealthy women, but his private investments included substantial holdings in 3 different pharmaceutical companies that manufactured the very products he prescribed to his patients. His treatment recommendations consistently favored expensive proprietary medicines over cheaper generic alternatives, generating profits for companies in which he held financial interests. The medical journals of the era published articles about the dangers of opium addiction, while simultaneously running advertisements for laudanum preparations that promised miraculous cures for the same conditions the articles described as symptoms of drug dependence. This contradiction reflected the medical profession's inability to reconcile its therapeutic responsibilities with its commercial relationships. The medical conferences and professional societies that should have addressed the laudanum epidemic instead focused on technical discussions about dosage calculations and preparation methods that effectively promoted more sophisticated drug use rather than encouraging abstinence or seeking alternative treatments. The pharmaceutical conferences of the Victorian era became showcases for increasingly potent opium preparations, with manufacturers competing to develop products that would capture larger shares of the lucrative female market. These gatherings, ostensibly dedicated to advancing medical science, functioned more like trade shows where drug companies displayed their latest formulations to physicians who would ultimately prescribe them to unsuspecting patients. Dr. Heinrich Müller, representing the prestigious German pharmaceutical house of Bayer, presented his company's revolutionary new laudanum concentrate at the 1869 International Medical Congress in Vienna. Müller's presentation emphasized the product's superior purity and consistent potency, qualities that he claimed would provide more reliable therapeutic effects for physicians treating delicate feminine conditions. What Dr. Müller didn't mention was that Bayer's new concentrate was nearly 3 times stronger than traditional laudanum preparations, making accidental overdoses far more likely for patients who had developed tolerance to weaker formulations. The company's internal research had identified this danger during product development, but marketing considerations outweighed safety concerns in their final decision to proceed with commercial production. The physicians attending Müller's presentation were impressed by the elegant packaging and professional marketing materials that accompanied the new product. Bayer had invested heavily in creating an image of scientific sophistication that appealed to medical professionals who wanted to offer their patients the latest advances in pharmaceutical technology. Dr. James Morrison, a London physician with a large practice among society ladies, placed an immediate order for Bayer's new concentrate after witnessing Müller's demonstration. Morrison was particularly attracted to the product's concentrated form, which would allow his patients to achieve the same effects with smaller doses, potentially reducing the obvious signs of medication that might attract unwanted attention. Morrison's first patient to receive the new preparation was Lady Elizabeth Peyton, who had been taking traditional laudanum for chronic headaches for nearly 2 years. Morrison explained that the new German medicine would provide superior relief with greater convenience, requiring only a few drops rather than the tablespoons of liquid she had been consuming. Lady Elizabeth was delighted by the prospect of a more discreet medication that wouldn't require her to carry large bottles or measure obvious quantities during social situations. She began taking the concentrated preparation with enthusiasm, initially pleased by its powerful effects and reduced volume. But within days of switching to the new medicine, Lady Elizabeth experienced symptoms that neither she nor Dr. Morrison understood. The concentrated preparation was so much stronger than her previous medication that her usual dosing schedule now provided massive overdoses, while attempts to reduce the amount triggered severe withdrawal symptoms that seemed to indicate inadequate treatment. Lady Elizabeth found herself trapped in a cycle of alternating overdose and withdrawal that made normal functioning impossible. She would take what seemed like a tiny amount of medicine only to become so heavily sedated that she couldn't remain conscious during important social obligations. When she tried to reduce the dose to maintain alertness, she would experience anxiety, nausea, and tremors that were worse than her original headaches. Dr. Morrison, lacking any understanding of the pharmacological differences between the old and new preparations, interpreted Lady Elizabeth's difficulties as evidence of worsening health that required more aggressive treatment. He increased her dosing schedule and added supplementary medications to address what he perceived as new symptoms of her underlying condition. The combination of concentrated laudanum with additional opiate preparations created a pharmaceutical cocktail that would have challenged the tolerance of experienced drug users. Lady Elizabeth, who had never intended to become addicted to any substance, found herself consuming amounts of opiates that exceeded the daily intake of professional drug dealers in London's East End. Her physical transformation was rapid and dramatic. Within weeks of beginning the new treatment, Lady Elizabeth had lost significant weight, developed a persistent tremor, and begun experiencing hallucinations that made social interaction increasingly difficult. Her skin took on the waxy, yellowish appearance characteristic of chronic opium poisoning, while her pupils remained constricted even in dim lighting. The servants in the Peyton household watched their mistresses decline with growing alarm. Mary Sullivan, Lady Elizabeth's personal maid, later described finding her employer unconscious in her sitting room on multiple occasions, sometimes with the concentrated medicine bottle still clutched in her hand. Mary's attempts to express concern about Lady Elizabeth's condition were dismissed by both her employer and Dr. Morrison, who explained that servants couldn't be expected to understand the complexities of medical treatment for sophisticated nervous disorders. Mary was instructed to ensure that Lady Elizabeth's privacy was protected and that her medication schedule was maintained exactly as prescribed. The isolation imposed by her deteriorating condition meant that Lady Elizabeth had no opportunity to compare her experiences with those of other women who might have warned her about the dangers of concentrated opium preparations. She existed in a medical bubble created by Dr. Morrison's confident pronouncements and her family's trusting acceptance of his expertise. Lady Elizabeth's husband, Sir Thomas Peyton, noticed his wife's dramatic changes, but accepted Dr. Morrison's explanations that her symptoms represented the natural progression of her underlying nervous condition. Sir Thomas had built his successful business career on trusting expert advice, and he applied the same approach to his wife's medical treatment. The financial cost of Lady Elizabeth's treatment escalated dramatically as her tolerance to the concentrated preparation increased. Dr. Morrison's bills, which had been substantial but manageable during her treatment with traditional laudanum, began consuming significant portions of the family's discretionary income. The concentrated medicine itself was far more expensive than conventional preparations, and Dr. Morrison's frequent consultations added additional charges. Sir Thomas began to question the value of his wife's medical expenses when her condition continued to worsen despite increasingly costly treatments. But his concerns about financial prudence were overwhelmed by his fear that reducing medical support might contribute to Lady Elizabeth's suffering or death. The social obligations that had once defined Lady Elizabeth's existence became impossible to fulfill as her addiction to the concentrated preparation progressed. She would agree to attend charity functions or dinner parties, then find herself too heavily sedated or too anxious about missing doses to leave her home. Her friends began to speculate about the mysterious illness that was transforming the vivacious woman they had known into a reclusive invalid. The most charitable interpretations suggested that Lady Elizabeth was suffering from consumption or some other wasting disease that required privacy and rest. Less charitable observers whispered about nervous breakdowns or hereditary madness that might explain her withdrawal from society. Lady Elizabeth's final public appearance occurred at a women's charity luncheon where she had promised to speak about support for orphaned children. She arrived at the event having taken what she calculated to be a moderate dose of her medicine, hoping to remain alert and articulate during her presentation, but her tolerance calculations proved fatally inaccurate. The concentrated preparation's unpredictable absorption rate meant that the effects hit her more suddenly and powerfully than anticipated. She began her speech normally, discussing the plight of homeless children with her usual passion and eloquence. Midway through her remarks, Lady Elizabeth's words began to slur, and she started repeating sentences without seeming to realize her error. Her audience, composed of society ladies who had known her for years, watched in horrified silence as she swayed behind the podium, struggling to maintain her balance while attempting to continue her presentation. The speech ended when Lady Elizabeth collapsed onto the luncheon table, scattering fine china and flower arrangements while losing consciousness completely. The women in attendance assumed she had suffered some sort of seizure or fainting spell brought on by her delicate constitution and the stress of public speaking. Dr. Morrison, summoned to treat Lady Elizabeth at the scene of her collapse, attributed her condition to nervous exhaustion and prescribed complete rest along with increased doses of her medication to prevent similar episodes in the future. He assured Sir Thomas that such incidents were common among ladies of refined sensibility who overtaxed their delicate systems. Lady Elizabeth never recovered from the humiliation of her public collapse. The incident confirmed her worst fears about her inability to control her medication effects, while the sympathetic concern expressed by her friends made her feel like a fraud who was deceiving people about her true condition. She began taking larger doses of the concentrated preparation to achieve the sense of peace and detachment that had initially attracted her to laudanum use. But the powerful medicine now required dangerous amounts to produce the desired effects, creating a pharmaceutical Russian roulette where each dose might be her last. Lady Elizabeth's death occurred on a quiet Tuesday afternoon as she sat in her favorite garden chair, reading a novel she had enjoyed before her addiction began. Mary Sullivan found her employer's body several hours later, the book still open in her lap and the concentrated medicine bottle empty beside her. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure brought on by chronic nervous exhaustion, a diagnosis that satisfied the coroner and preserved the family's reputation. Dr. Morrison signed the death certificate without hesitation, genuinely believing that Lady Elizabeth had succumbed to the progressive nervous disorder he had been treating. The funeral arrangements reflected the social standing Lady Elizabeth had maintained throughout her addiction, with hundreds of mourners attending services that celebrated her charitable works and feminine virtues. The minister spoke movingly about her patient endurance of suffering and her devotion to helping society's most vulnerable members. Sir Thomas commissioned a memorial window in the local church that depicted Lady Elizabeth as an angel of mercy watching over orphan children. The image became a lasting symbol of the Victorian feminine ideal, commemorating a woman whose actual death had resulted from the pharmaceutical industry's reckless pursuit of profit and the medical profession's dangerous ignorance about addiction. The concentrated laudanum preparations that had killed Lady Elizabeth continued to be marketed aggressively throughout England and America, with manufacturers developing even more potent formulations to capture competitive advantages in the expanding market for feminine medicines. The lessons that might have been learned from her death remained hidden behind the elaborate deceptions that Victorian society used to protect itself from uncomfortable truths. Dr. Morrison continued his medical practice without any recognition of his role in Lady Elizabeth's death, eventually becoming a respected authority on the treatment of nervous disorders among upper-class women. His techniques for managing delicate feminine constitutions were adopted by physicians throughout the English-speaking world, ensuring that Lady Elizabeth's tragedy would be repeated countless times in drawing rooms and private chambers across the civilized world. The pharmaceutical industry's development of concentrated opium preparations represented just one aspect of a broader trend towards stronger and more dangerous products designed to capture market share in the competitive laudanum trade. Companies began adding alcohol, cocaine, and other addictive substances to their opium-based medicines, creating combination products that were even more habit-forming than pure opium preparations. Mrs. Pemberton's miracle elixir combined laudanum with a substantial amount of cocaine, producing effects that patients described as remarkably energizing compared to traditional opium medicines. The cocaine masked some of opium's sedating effects, allowing women to remain functional while consuming dangerous amounts of opiates. Sarah Mitchell, a minister's wife from Yorkshire, became one of the first customers to try Mrs. Pemberton's new formula after her usual laudanum supplier recommended it as a superior treatment for the chronic fatigue that had been troubling her for months. Sarah was immediately impressed by the elixir's ability to provide pain relief without the drowsiness that had been interfering with her church duties. The cocaine component of Mrs. Pemberton's formula created a euphoric energy that Sarah had never experienced with traditional laudanum. She felt capable of accomplishing enormous amounts of work, organizing charity drives with unprecedented enthusiasm, while maintaining her medication schedule without the obvious impairment that had characterized her previous drug use. But the combination of opium and cocaine created addiction patterns that were far more complex and dangerous than either drug alone. Sarah found herself requiring increasing amounts of the elixir to maintain her energy levels while experiencing withdrawal symptoms that combined the worst aspects of both cocaine and opium dependence. The cocaine withdrawal created depression and exhaustion that were far more severe than anything Sarah had experienced during her years of laudanum use, while the opium withdrawal produced physical symptoms that made normal functioning impossible. The combination meant that any attempt to reduce her medication consumption triggered multiple types of withdrawal simultaneously. Sarah's consumption of Mrs. Pemberton's elixir escalated rapidly as her tolerance to both components increased independently. She progressed from taking the recommended dose twice daily to consuming entire bottles at single sittings, driven by craving patterns that were more intense and unpredictable than traditional opium addiction. The financial cost of maintaining Sarah's addiction to the combination preparation quickly exceeded her household's ability to support it through normal channels. Mrs. Pemberton's formula was significantly more expensive than traditional laudanum, and Sarah's escalating consumption created budget crises that forced her to seek alternative funding sources. Sarah began embezzling money from church collections, initially taking small amounts that she intended to replace before anyone noticed their absence. But her addiction progressed faster than her ability to conceal the theft, and the missing funds eventually attracted the attention of church auditors, who discovered systematic financial manipulation spanning several months. The scandal of a minister's wife stealing from church funds created a crisis that extended far beyond Sarah's personal addiction. Her husband faced demands for his resignation from parishioners who could no longer trust his family's moral leadership, while the church congregation split between those who supported forgiveness and those who demanded accountability. Sarah's trial for embezzlement became a public spectacle that exposed the reality of feminine drug addiction to communities that had preferred to ignore its existence. The evidence presented in court included detailed records of her medicine purchases, creating an official record of consumption levels that shocked even experienced physicians. The prosecuting attorney used Sarah's case to argue for stricter regulation of patent medicines, pointing to her addiction as evidence that pharmaceutical companies were deliberately creating products designed to foster dependence. But the defense countered that Sarah's condition was a medical issue rather than a criminal matter, arguing that she should receive treatment rather than punishment. The jury's verdict reflected society's confusion about how to address drug addiction among respectable women. They found Sarah guilty of theft, but recommended lenient sentencing based on her medical condition, creating a legal precedent that acknowledged both the reality of addiction and the need for social accountability when drug dependence led to criminal behavior. Sarah's sentencing hearing revealed the complete inadequacy of the legal system's response to laudanum addiction. The judge, lacking any understanding of addiction treatment, sentenced her to 6 months in prison, followed by mandatory residence in a private sanitarium where she would receive medical supervision. This approach satisfied no one while helping nothing. The prison environment proved catastrophic for Sarah's physical and mental health. Cut off from her medication supply without medical supervision, she experienced withdrawal symptoms so severe that prison doctors feared for her life. They had no training in addiction treatment and no protocols for managing opiate withdrawal, leaving Sarah to suffer through hallucinations, convulsions, and delirium that lasted for weeks. The other female prisoners, mostly prostitutes and thieves from London's poorest neighborhoods, initially viewed Sarah with suspicion and resentment. Her refined accent and obvious middle-class background marked her as different from their usual cellmates. But as they witnessed her withdrawal agony, many recognized symptoms they had seen in their own lives or those of their associates who used opium recreationally. Mary Flanagan, a pickpocket serving time for theft, became Sarah's unofficial caretaker during the worst phases of withdrawal. Mary had grown up in London's East End, where opium use was common and openly acknowledged, giving her practical knowledge about managing withdrawal symptoms that prison officials lacked. Mary would sit beside Sarah during her worst moments, holding her hand steady when tremors made eating impossible and talking her through panic attacks that left her gasping for breath. The bond formed between these two women from vastly different social backgrounds illustrated how laudanum addiction transcended class distinctions in its basic human impact. Sarah's experience in prison forced her to confront the reality of her addiction. Without the elaborate social mechanisms that had enabled her denial, stripped of her respectable identity and comfortable surroundings, she could no longer pretend that her drug use was simply medical treatment for legitimate health conditions. The sanitarium where Sarah was transferred after completing her prison sentence represented the era's most advanced approach to treating female addiction. But even these specialized facilities operated with limited understanding of effective treatment methods. The Willowbrook Institute for Nervous Disorders promised revolutionary treatments based on European methods, but their actual techniques differed little from the rest cures that had failed countless other women. Dr. Augustus Blackwell, Willowbrook's medical director, believed that feminine addiction resulted from moral weakness combined with physical delicacy that made women particularly susceptible to the corrupting influence of powerful medicines. His treatment protocol emphasized moral instruction, religious counseling, and gradual reduction of opiate medications under strict medical supervision. Sarah's treatment began with complete isolation from outside influences that might undermine her recovery. She was confined to a small room furnished only with basic necessities, denied access to books, letters, or visitors who might remind her of the circumstances that had led to her addiction. Dr. Blackwell believed that such distractions would interfere with the moral reflection necessary for genuine reformation. The medication reduction schedule imposed at Willowbrook was based on theoretical calculations rather than individual patient needs or responses. Sarah's daily laudanum dose was reduced by predetermined amounts according to a rigid timeline that took no account of her withdrawal symptoms or psychological state. The physical agony of forced withdrawal was compounded by the psychological pressure of constant moral evaluation by staff members who interpreted any sign of distress as evidence of insufficient commitment to recovery. Sarah's requests for additional medication to ease withdrawal symptoms were recorded as moral failures, while her physical symptoms were attributed to weakness of character rather than medical necessity. The other women confined at Willowbrook represented a cross-section of Victorian society's laudanum casualties. Lady Margaret Ashworth had been committed by her husband after her addiction had progressed to the point where she could no longer fulfill basic social obligations. Miss Catherine Peyton, a judge's daughter, had been sent for treatment after attempting suicide when her family discovered her drug use. These women formed an unlikely community bound by shared suffering and mutual understanding that transcended their normal social boundaries. In whispered conversations during brief moments when staff supervision was relaxed, they shared stories of how their addictions had begun, strategies they had used to conceal their drug use, and fears about their futures after treatment. The institutional routine at Willowbrook was designed to replace the chaos of addiction with structured activities that would rebuild moral character and feminine virtue. Sarah's days began with mandatory religious services, followed by domestic instruction intended to restore her capacity for proper household management. The afternoons were devoted to moral improvement through reading carefully selected literature that emphasized themes of feminine duty, self-sacrifice, and redemption through suffering. Sarah was required to write daily reflections on these readings, demonstrating her progress toward understanding the spiritual lessons her addiction was meant to teach. The treatment philosophy underlying these activities reflected Victorian society's fundamental misunderstanding of addiction as a moral rather than medical condition. Dr. Blackwell genuinely believed that Sarah's recovery depended on her ability to acknowledge her moral failings and commit to a life of greater virtue and self-discipline. But the actual effect of this approach was to increase Sarah's shame and self-loathing without addressing the physical and psychological factors that had made her vulnerable to addiction in the first place. She learned to provide the responses that staff members wanted to hear while privately struggling with cravings and withdrawal symptoms that the moral instruction did nothing to alleviate. The gradual medication reduction imposed at Willowbrook created a prolonged withdrawal experience that was more psychologically damaging than the rapid detoxification Sarah had endured in prison. The constant awareness that her doses were being reduced, combined with the knowledge that any sign of distress would be interpreted as moral weakness, created anxiety that made the withdrawal symptoms more severe. Sarah's physical health deteriorated significantly during her months at Willowbrook, despite the institution's claims about the healing benefits of their treatment methods. The stress of forced withdrawal combined with the inadequate nutrition provided by the institutional diet left her weak and susceptible to infections that further complicated her recovery. The social isolation imposed as part of Sarah's treatment proved particularly devastating for someone whose addiction had already destroyed her family relationships and community standing. Cut off from any supportive human contact, she began to question whether recovery was possible or even desirable, given the life of shame and rejection that awaited her upon release. The financial burden of Sarah's treatment at Willowbrook created additional stress for her husband, whose congregation had still not fully forgiven the scandal of his wife's theft from church funds. The sanitarium's fees consumed most of the family's savings, while his reduced income from lost parishioners made it difficult to maintain their household during Sarah's absence. Reverend Mitchell faced pressure from church leadership to divorce his wife and seek a fresh start with a new congregation where his reputation wouldn't be tainted by association with addiction and criminal behavior. But his religious convictions about the sanctity of marriage conflicted with practical considerations about his ability to continue his ministry while supporting a wife whose condition had brought disgrace upon his calling. The children of the Mitchell family suffered perhaps the most severe consequences of their mother's addiction and imprisonment. They faced social ostracism from classmates whose parents considered them contaminated by association with criminal behavior, while struggling to understand why their mother had disappeared from their lives so suddenly and completely. Young Thomas Mitchell, only 12 years old when his mother was imprisoned, developed behavioral problems that reflected his confusion and anger about the family situation. His academic performance declined dramatically, and he began fighting with other students who made references to his mother's crime. The psychological impact on these children would extend far into their adult lives, shaping their attitudes toward authority, their ability to trust relationships, and their own vulnerability to substance abuse. The shame and secrecy surrounding their mother's condition taught them to hide their own emotional struggles rather than seeking help when they needed support. Sarah's eventual release from Willowbrook after 18 months of treatment represented a hollow victory for the institutional approach to addiction recovery. While she had successfully completed the medication reduction program and could demonstrate her ability to function without laudanum, the underlying issues that had made her vulnerable to addiction remained unaddressed. The woman who returned to her family bore little resemblance to the energetic minister's wife, who had once organized charity drives and led women's prayer groups. Sarah had lost significant weight during her treatment. Her hair had become prematurely gray, and she moved with the hesitant gait of someone who had learned to distrust her own physical capabilities. The community's reception of Sarah's return reflected the mixed attitudes Victorian society held toward reformed addicts. While some parishioners expressed Christian forgiveness and welcomed her back into the congregation, others remained suspicious about whether her recovery was genuine and whether she could be trusted with responsibility or respect. Sarah's attempts to rebuild her life were hampered by the lasting physical effects of her addiction and treatment experience. The prolonged withdrawal had left her with chronic digestive problems, sleep disorders, and episodes of depression that made it difficult to maintain the emotional stability expected of a minister's wife. The financial consequences of Sarah's addiction continued to affect the Mitchell family for years after her recovery. The legal fees, treatment costs, and restitution payments had consumed their savings and forced them to accept a smaller, less prestigious congregation where Reverend Mitchell's damaged reputation was less well known. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Sarah's experience was her newfound understanding of addiction as a medical rather than moral condition. Having witnessed the suffering of other women at Willowbrook and experienced the inadequacy of moralistic treatment approaches, she began to advocate privately for better understanding of drug dependence among the women in her new community. Sarah's recovery, while incomplete and fragile, represented one of the rare success stories in Victorian addiction treatment. Most women who developed serious laudanum dependence either died from overdoses or spent their remaining years cycling between periods of sobriety and relapse, never finding effective support for long-term recovery. The pharmaceutical industry's response to growing awareness of addiction problems was to develop new marketing strategies that emphasize the safety and non-addictive nature of their products, rather than actually reformulating medicines to reduce their addictive potential. Companies began using testimonials from supposedly recovered patients to demonstrate that their products could be used safely when taken as directed. Mrs. Hartwell's feminine restorative was marketed as a breakthrough preparation that provided all the therapeutic benefits of traditional laudanum without the risk of dependence. The advertising campaign featured letters from grateful customers who claimed to have used the product successfully for years without developing tolerance or craving. What the advertisements didn't reveal was that Mrs. Hartwell's formula contained the same amount of opium as traditional laudanum preparations, combined with additional ingredients that were intended to mask the taste and smell that might alert users to the presence of narcotic substances. The product was no safer than conventional medicines, but its deceptive marketing convinced many women that they were choosing a healthier alternative. Caroline Whitmore began using Mrs. Hartwell's preparation after reading testimonials that promised effective treatment for nervous exhaustion without the drowsiness and confusion she had experienced with previous medications. Caroline was particularly attracted to the product's claim that it would allow her to maintain her active social schedule while receiving medical treatment. The initial effects of Mrs. Hartwell's formula seemed to confirm the advertising claims. Caroline felt energetic and capable while taking the medicine, and she didn't experience the obvious sedation that had characterized her previous laudanum use. She was able to attend dinner parties and charity events without appearing impaired, leading her to believe that she had finally found a safe and effective treatment. But within weeks of beginning the new preparation, Caroline noticed that she was taking the medicine more frequently than the label recommended. The effects seemed to wear off more quickly than expected, and she found herself reaching for additional doses to maintain the sense of well-being that had initially impressed her. Caroline's tolerance to Mrs. Hartwell's formula developed rapidly, requiring her to consume increasing amounts to achieve the same therapeutic effects. But because the medicine didn't produce obvious signs of intoxication, she was able to maintain the illusion that her use remained within normal medical bounds. The deceptive nature of Mrs. Hartwell's marketing created particularly dangerous situations for women like Caroline, who believed they were using safe alternatives to traditional laudanum. They would consume dangerous amounts of opium while remaining convinced that they were avoiding the addiction risks associated with older preparations. Caroline's consumption of Mrs. Hartwell's formula eventually exceeded that of many women who were using conventional laudanum preparations, but her continued ability to function socially prevented her from recognizing the severity of her dependence. She attributed her need for frequent doses to the particularly severe nature of her nervous condition, rather than understanding that she had developed tolerance to the opium in her medicine. The financial cost of maintaining Caroline's addiction to Mrs. Hartwell's preparation was substantial, as the product was priced as a premium medicine that commanded higher prices than generic laudanum preparations. But Caroline justified the expense by believing that she was investing in her health rather than feeding an addiction. Caroline's family noticed changes in her behavior and personality that they attributed to improvement in her underlying nervous condition. The energy and optimism she displayed while taking Mrs. Hartwell's formula seemed to indicate that she was finally receiving effective medical treatment, leading them to support her continued use of the expensive preparation. The tragic irony of Caroline's situation was that her family's well-intentioned support for what they believed was successful medical treatment actually enabled her progression toward a more severe addiction than she might have developed with conventional laudanum. The deceptive marketing of Mrs. Hartwell's formula had created a perfect storm of medical misinformation, family enablement, and pharmaceutical manipulation. The stories of Caroline Whitmore and countless others like her represent more than individual tragedies. They reveal a systematic failure that claimed an entire generation of Victorian women, hidden behind parlor doors and buried beneath layers of social respectability. These weren't isolated cases of moral weakness or feminine frailty. They were victims of an industry that prioritized profit over human life, a medical establishment that confused ignorance with expertise, and a society that chose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The laudanum epidemic stands as a stark reminder that progress without compassion leads only to elegant destruction, and that the most dangerous poisons often come wrapped in the most beautiful packages.